Ever feel like the world is stuck on repeat? Like it's playing this broken record of work, hustle, repeat. Is this really all there is?
It's a pretty common feeling these days.
Well, get this. We dove into this AI podcast called Tanping, Quiet Quitting, and the Role of AI in a Failing System.
Okay, I've heard of that one, yeah.
And man, it gets wild. Like it's talking about how the old ways of doing things, they just aren't cutting it anymore.
And it's not just some small group of people feeling this way. It's like this global phenomenon.
Right. It's like the whole world is on the same inside joke. But the punchline is the system's broken.
And nobody's laughing.
Exactly. So this podcast host, who, by the way, goes by the Technomage.
Okay, that's pretty cool.
Right. So he talks about this thing called Tanping in China. Have you heard of this?
Yeah, it's basically a whole movement of young people who are just done with the rat race. They're saying peace out to the constant pressure of climbing the corporate ladder.
It's like quiet quitting, but on a whole other level.
Exactly. And the podcast, it connects both of these trends, tamping and quiet quitting, to this idea of involution.
Involution. Break that down for me. What does that even mean?
So imagine you're putting in more effort, more hours, more of yourself, but instead of climbing up, you just feel stuck.
Ooh, stuck. Like on one of those hamster wheels.
Exactly. You're working harder, but you're not getting ahead. And it's this feeling of being trapped in a system that's rigged against you.
And I bet a lot of people listening right now know exactly what that feels like. But is it just us? Or are there actually concrete reasons why it feels so impossible to get ahead these days?
Oh, it's not just you. The podcast digs into some real reasons behind this feeling. Like, let's talk about housing costs.
Don't even get me started on rent.
Right. And then there's education. It's become so expensive that a lot of people are starting their adult lives drowning in debt.
It's like all those things our parents told us were achievable. You know, buy a house, get a good education, have a family. It all feels kind of impossible now.
Yeah, a lot of those traditional markers of success feel more and more out of reach for younger generations. And it's not just a local thing. It's happening globally.
Okay, so it's not just me. Yeah. But seriously, the whole work hard, get ahead thing,
Yeah.
starting to feel like a broken promise.
It's interesting you say that because the podcast actually talks about this feeling of disillusionment. It introduces this idea of a generational divide. Have you heard of the Sampo generation?
Sampo generation. Nope, that's a new one. Tell me more.
It's a term that comes from Korea, and it refers to young people who are basically opting out of the traditional 3 pillars of adult life.
Okay, and those are...
Relationships, marriage, and kids.
Whoa. Giving up on all of that. That's a whole other level of disillusion. It's not even quiet quitting anymore. It's like quiet existing. But seriously, why? Why are they giving up on these major life milestones?
The podcast argues that it's because they feel like the system is rigged against them and they don't see a way to win. It's like they're saying, if I can't even afford to live on my own, how am I supposed to support a family?
Man, that's heavy stuff. And it makes you wonder, is this a permanent shift in values? Like, are younger generations just done with these traditional goals? Or is this a desperate response to a system that feels impossible to thrive in?
That's the million-dollar question. And speaking of impossible systems and million-dollar questions, that's where AI comes into the picture.
Wait, hold up. AI. Now.
Because according to this podcast, AI is being viewed as both a potential escape hatch from this whole mess and a potential threat.
Okay, now we're getting to the good stuff. It's officially Things Just Got Wilder time on the podcast. We're going to take a quick break, but don't go anywhere. We'll be right back to unpack this whole AI thing after these messages. And we are back. We're talking about how the old work hard, get ahead motto is starting to feel like a broken promise.
Yeah, like a cassette tape stuck on repeat. Only the music is the sound of our dreams fizzling out.
Okay, that's a little too real. But things aren't looking so good. And just when you thought it couldn't get weirder, we're throwing AI into the mix.
Because remember, the podcast we're discussing today sees AI as this kind of two-sided coin. On one side, it could be our ticket out of this mess, but on the other...
It could make everything a million times worse.
Exactly. It all depends on how it's used and, more importantly, who's in control.
Okay, so double sword, got it. But how exactly could AI be our saving grace? How do we use it to escape this whole involution hamster wheel thing?
Well, imagine if AI could automate all those jobs nobody wants to do. And I'm not just talking about factory jobs, but think white collar too. Data entry, scheduling.
Hold on, is AI coming for my job?
Relax, I think you're safe. At least for now. But seriously, what if AI could take those tasks off our plates?
Okay, I see where you're going with this. More time for the good stuff.
Right. more time for creativity, for meaningful connections, for actually enjoying life. And it's not just about freeing up our schedules.
It's about fixing those huge societal problems we talked about earlier, right?
Mhm.
Like the housing crisis, the climate.
Exactly. AI could be the ultimate problem solver, helping us fix the very systems that seem to be failing us.
Okay, now that is a hopeful thought. AI swoops in like some kind of tech superhero.
Right. Like a digital Superman. But, and this is a big but,
There's always a but.
this podcast isn't sugarcoating things. It reminds us that as powerful as AI can be for good, it can also be used for some pretty shady stuff.
Right, because anything that powerful, it's a tool. It's
Yeah.
all about who's holding the hammer.
Precisely. And the podcast specifically calls out how authoritarian governments could use AI to control their citizens. We're talking increased surveillance, censorship.
It's like that Black Mirror episode, but in real life.
Exactly. And it's not just governments. Think about how social media algorithms are already being used to manipulate people. AI could take that to a whole new level.
Okay, yeah, that's officially terrifying.
Right. And we're not talking about some far-off dystopian future. These things are happening right now.
So what do we do? How do we make sure AI is used for good and not, for evil?
Mm-hmm.
Because right now it kind of feels like we're just along for the ride and this AI train is picking up speed.
Well, the good news is we're not totally powerless. According to this podcast, AI can actually be a tool for resisting those very forces that want to control us.
So we've explored this whole AI thing, and it seems like it could go either way. Amazing breakthroughs or total dystopia.
Yeah, it's a real nail biter. But for those listening, what can we actually do with all this information?
Right, because it's easy to feel overwhelmed. Like, is there any way to actually influence how this all plays out?
That's where the podcast gets really interesting. It reminds us that we're not just helpless bystanders. We actually have a lot more power than we realize.
Really? But how? AI seems so big, so inevitable. What can we actually do to steer things in the right direction?
Well, for starters, we can start by being aware. The more we understand about AI, how it works, its potential benefits and risks, the better equipped we'll be to make informed decisions.
Okay, knowledge is power. That makes sense. But it's not just about understanding the tech, right? It's also about who's controlling it.
Exactly. And that's where things get a little more complicated. Because as we've seen, AI can be used to concentrate power in the hands of a few, whether it's governments or tech corporations.
So how do we prevent that? How do we make sure AI is used for good and not just to benefit a select few?
Well, it's not going to be easy. But the podcast highlights how AI can also be a tool for resistance. It can be used to challenge those in power and create a more equitable world.
Okay, now that's interesting. We were talking earlier about AI being used for surveillance and censorship. How can it also be used to fight against those things?
Think about it. AI can be used to create secure communication channels that are much harder for governments to monitor. It can be used to develop tools that help people bypass censorship. It can even be used to organize and mobilize people in ways that weren't possible before.
So in the right hands, AI could be a force for positive change, even in the face of oppression.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations, to raise awareness and to empower people with the knowledge they need to make a difference.
I love that. Knowledge as a form of resistance.
Mm.
And I think this podcast episode is a perfect example of that. It's sparking a conversation, and that's how we start to shape a better future, a future where technology serves humanity, not the other way around.
Absolutely. It's about reclaiming our agency, recognizing that we're not just passive consumers of technology. We have a voice and we have a choice in how this all unfolds.
Beautifully said. And on that note, we'll leave you with this final thought. As AI becomes more and more intertwined with our lives, it's up to us to decide what role it will play. Will we be passive bystanders, or will we be active participants in shaping a future where AI is used to benefit everyone? It's a question worth pondering. Until next time, keep asking questions, keep learning, and most importantly, keep the conversation going.